You're listening to the audiobook version of This Is Me Trying by Love Curd on Tumblr, AO3, Wattpad, etc. Warnings for this chapter. None really, not gonna lie. Just very honest and open conversation. But, same as all the other warnings in previous chapters, just be cautious if you see anything that may trigger you. This is semi-autobiographical, so please be kind. In short, if you're emotionally or mentally vulnerable, please do not interact. 3. The world buzzed with static around him, each second feeling like an eternity. Time stood still, just like the day Mike took off his watch. His hands were shaking, the anticipation inside him about to explode like fireworks. He balled his hands up into fists and put them in his sweatshirt pockets, but immediately pulled them back out because he could feel his palms getting sweaty. Mike glanced around and saw the next-door neighbor taking her dog out for a walk. He raised his hand in an awkward greeting, and she smiled back at him. He watched her run further and further away, until they were out of his line of sight. A minute had definitely passed by now. He turned his attention back to the door, and lifted his hand again, going to knock one last time. But then, before he was able to, Will opened the door. Mike froze, his hands still in the air. He lowered his arm slowly and took a mental photograph of Will's awe-stricken face before he was met with a face full of door. He should have seen that coming. He leaned his head against the door, exhaling with a shaky breath. Will, I know I'm the last person you want to see. He hesitated, digging his nails into his palms. This was likely going to be his first of many fumbles. This is going fucking splendidly already, Jesus Christ. There was no response on Will's end, but Mike figured he might as well get everything off his chest, even if Will wasn't there to hear it. Saying it out loud could probably suffice. I guess I should start by saying I'm sorry. For everything. For hurting you with my words, with my actions, for being so fucking reckless with my life. I've accumulated a lot of regrets over the past few years, but here goes nothing. Loving you will never be one of them. Mike closed his eyes with his head still on the door, but jumped back a bit in surprise when he felt a light thump right next to his face. Will? I'm listening. The faint sound of Will's voice was music to Mike's ears, low and velvety, with a hint of rasp. His stomach nervously flipped as he cleared his throat, continuing on. I've been a mess without you. I don't know who I am without you. This is me trying to say... Mike trailed off. What was he trying to say? How could he reduce his love for Will into a single sentence? How could he explain himself in a concise yet bold form that wouldn't scare Will away? He couldn't. He was doomed regardless of how the conversation would unfold. He asked Will the first thing that came to mind. You ever been to a college party? Yeah, a few. Well, I just failed out of school because I went to way too many of them. I just drove here for my last one, actually. He tried to add a bit of humor to his voice, but it ended up coming out sounding pathetically broken. Fumble number 2. Fuck it all. Everything was going down in flames. Mike set his hand on the door, caressing the painted surface as if it were Will's face. But here's the thing. It's hard to be at a party when you feel like an open wound. You're all I think about, and it's like I can't let go. It's hard to be anywhere these days when all I want is you. And even though you don't love me, and even if we can never be friends again, I need that closure, Will, and I need you to understand that I won't move on if that never happens. Mike felt the doorknob click below, and he lifted his head up just as the door opened again. Will emerged, tears lining his cheeks. Motherfucking fumble number 3. When Will and Mike were little, they functioned as a unit. When Will was happy, Mike was happy. When Will would cry, Mike would cry with him. Now, Mike felt like he was 5 years old again, getting choked up at the sight of Will crying and mentally cursed himself. Fuck, now I've made you cry for the umpteenth time in our lives, what else is new? Will crossed his arms across his chest and looked down towards the ground, still on the defensive, but his voice betrayed him when he said, No, please don't worry about me, it's fine, and His voice wobbled. I'm sorry for slamming the door. I was just so... Mike nodded in sorrowful understanding. Yeah. He took a good look at Will, noticing how Will's hair had finally grown out of the bowl cut, falling into his eyes in loose copper waves, ending just above his strong jaw. His eyes, even obscured with tears, looked green as ever. Mike wanted to drown in them. You changed your hair, Mike heard himself say. Will let out a small smile at that. brushing some of his bangs out of his eyes, along with some tears that had attached themselves to his eyelashes. Yeah, the bowl cut was kind of archaic. Both of them began awkwardly laughing while still crying. Mike had to refrain from thinking too much, because if he did, he'd get all sentimental about how this was the first time he'd laughed with Will and he couldn't even remember. You like it though? He asked. He still sought his approval after everything. Of course Mike liked it. Mike liked Will's hair no matter how it was cut. But this style that Will was sporting currently had Mike falling flat on his face, and not literally for once. Yeah, it really suits you, he told Will, who was flattered at the compliment. Thank you. I mean, Mom's skill set with scissors was limited, but she tried. Mike thought of that one time he'd walked into the Byers household unannounced back in junior year of high school. Will was sitting on a chair in the middle of the kitchen with a literal bowl on his head as Joyce shuffled around her son with a pair of kitchen shears. Joyce was an incredible mom who loved both of her boys unconditionally. Which reminded Mike, how'd you get my number? Your mom gave it to me over Christmas break. She shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry for letting her give me your number, he apologized, picking at the nails of his index fingers with his thumbs. And I'm sorry for calling you on your birthday. I should have respected your space. No, I'm sorry, Will replied quickly, eyes wide. I was being a total asshole that day. I know this doesn't excuse what I said to you, but I'll have you know that I just failed an English test. Did you not read the material? Mike smirked, and Will smiled back up at him, their eyes fully meeting for the first time. You know me too well, he said, and Mike's heart skipped a beat. But then, when I thought my day couldn't get any worse, my boyfriend at the time broke up with me. Mike gawked at that, his eyes narrowing. On your birthday? That's ass. Will leaned against the doorframe. Mike Wheeler, everyone. Ex-English major, literary nerd, and author. Mike ignored the not-so-subtle roast in favor of Will's muscles, which were even more defined than he remembered. Will had obviously become well acquainted with the gym. His gaze trailed along the divots of his biceps, and his mouth went dry when he realized that Will was wearing the blue sweatshirt Mike had sworn had gone missing during senior year. But yeah, Will continued. Leave it to Matt Winters to ruin the one day of the year where I don't feel like shit. So when you called, I'd just gotten back home. And I felt so guilty for snapping at you and hanging up that I didn't call you back after the fact because I was afraid you'd be mad at me. Are you kidding? I could never be mad at you. Ever, Mike emphasized. And we both know I'm not a good person when I hold grudges. Will's strong eyebrows furrowed, and Mike feared he'd said something wrong, but Will rose up onto his tiptoes, lifting his hand up to Mike's forehead in mock concern. Mike, are you okay? Do you need medical assistance? Yes. If Will was going to act all flirty and cute and tiptoey and forehead touchy, then they'd need to call an ambulance, because Mike was down bad. You're funny, Mike deadpanned at the joke, despite himself. Will retreated back to his spot in the doorway. But seriously, I just told you that I have a real live ex, and you're not mad? How could Mike be mad at Will for that? Why would Mike be mad at Will for that? It wasn't like Mike had any right or say as to who Will dated, and if Mike did so much as judge Will for any romance-related decisions, he'd be the biggest fucking hypocrite to ever walk the earth. He figured he'd come clean to Will about this one. It was the whole reason why he was here, after all. Will, I hooked up with 4 guys. Should he say this next part? Sure, okay, whatever. And all of them had the initials WB. Mike's focus shifted down to his shoes, too humiliated to see Will's reaction. But he didn't even have to see it, because Will giggled, like high-pitched and adorably. Mike's head snapped up, and Will, having gotten caught laughing at Mike's biggest shame, slapped his own hand to his mouth in a failed attempt to stifle it. No way, Will said, his voice still suppressed with his hand. Way, Mike quit back. He decided to try something new then, reaching up to Will's wrist and pulling his hand away from his face. His beautiful lips were curved into a shy smile. Will shook his head, crossing his arms again, but not in hostility like he had before. I don't believe you. And all of a sudden, it was August 1989, and they were back in Mike's basement again. Those were Will's last words to Mike before he'd stormed out, never to be seen again. And a year and a half later, Will became thoroughly aware of the aftermath, where Mike tried and failed to fill the will-less void with Wyatt Bowman, Wes Butler, Walker Brooks, Warren Blakely. He listed off what he'd endearingly dubbed the WB's TM, but now in retrospect viewed as fucking pathetic, and watched as Will exhaled sadly. He tacked the only thing he could think of onto the end of his list to lighten the mood. And there was a guy named Elvis. Will snorted. Like Presley? Exactly. Jesus, Will whispered, running a hand through his hair. Mike wished it was his hand instead. As he took in Will's jarred reaction, his world went cold. It made more sense when Mike shivered, looked up, and felt a few snowflakes land on his eyelids. He lowered his gaze back to Will, avoiding the impending guilt with light-hearted bluntness. Yeah, he concluded unceremoniously. So, you've an ex-boyfriend, and I have a disturbingly high body count. I think that makes us even. Will's lips formed a line, and Mike diverted his eyes back to the ground. He watched Will's feet, clad in fuzzy socks and slippers, shift backwards. The moment was finally here. This was the end. They were not, in fact, even. Will was shutting him out for the last time, giving Mike the closure he'd practically begged for. Mike lifted his head so he could at least say goodbye properly, but saw that Will was waiting for him? Want to come inside? He asked, and Mike raised his eyebrows in shock. Well, that was a plot twist if he had ever seen one. He took a deep breath, muttering a slow, yeah, sure, and followed Will into his house. Mike took off his mud-caked shoes at the front door, remembering how much of a neat freak Will was and imagining his reaction if he tracked the past 7 or so hours into the house. He expected it would probably begin with Michael James. Once situated, he took a look around the living room. There were multiple swirly wooden furniture pieces that Mike knew Will wouldn't have picked out in a million years, but he'd still managed to make the apartment his own. Framed movie posters, a black couch, and a few bookshelves were sprinkled modestly amongst otherwise very feminine decor. Mike walked over to the bookshelves, which were fully stacked with comic books and picture frames. He peered at one of Will, posed with Ivy and Hannah, who gripped onto either side of a metal pole that Will had perched atop his shoulders as he lifted them in a white muscle tank top. He knew he'd started working out. God, Will was attractive. He smiled to himself, moving on to look at the next photo. It was the exact same one Mike had on his desk. The photo that Jonathan took of Mike on Will's handlebars. Mike felt like crying again, so he looked away before that could happen. His attention was drawn to the ceiling, which was lined with Christmas lights. He guessed the passage of time had thankfully worked in Will's favor as well. So Kate's at work? Mike asked, and Will whipped around from where he'd been organizing one of his other bookshelves, like he cared about what Mike thought in regard to his preference of alphabetical versus publisher order. How do you know about Kate? Mike hesitated, expression sheepish. I ran into your friends Ivy and Hannah on campus. They're how I found you. Will blanched. Oh God. What did they say to you? Mike shook his head in reassurance, taking a step towards Will. Nothing out of the ordinary. I think they were just worried about me because I was kind of lost. You didn't think to get a map? Will, the little shit, teased as he took a step of his own towards Mike. I had one, Will. Mike tossed a hand up in exasperation. I just couldn't read it correctly. He phrased the last part of his sentence more like a question, which Will must have thought was funny, because he moved a few inches closer to Mike in order to poke his chest. Okay, that tracks. He grinned, and Mike feigned offense as he felt Will's fingerprint burn a hole in his sweatshirt, the fire expanding to scorch his entire torso. Will was close enough that Mike could hear Will breathing lightly through his nose, and could see the freckles scattered like constellations across his neck. His eyes traveled up a bit to land on the one mole above Will's lip, and he fought the urge to kiss it. Ivy and Hannah said to tell you they said you're welcome, by the way, whatever that means. He breathed, and Will processed what Mike had just told him before bringing his hands up to his own face as he turned beet red. Of course they did. Mike observed Will's reaction, pushing down the bit of hope that bubbled up inside of him. He hadn't a single clue of what Will told his two friends, but the way he reacted made him think that maybe it wasn't all that terrible. Wait. Will brought a hand up to lightly smack his forehead. I'm so stupid. I should have asked when you first came in. You're not stupid at all. If anything, I'm stupid, but go on, Mike thought. Do you need anything to drink or eat? You look like shit. Wow, Mike said as he glared back at Will, giving away his joking nature with a small lift of his lips. But sure, water is fine, thank you. Will stood there for a moment in contemplation. Mike gulped, feeling incredibly anxious as to what Will would say next. I'm gonna make you pancakes, he told Mike, ambition in his tone. Mike wasn't even supposed to be there, yet there Will was, taking on the role of hospitable host. Mike shrugged, leaving the option up to Will as to if he really wanted to be that kind to him. You don't have to. Will was the one who shortened the distance between them this time, taking Mike's much larger hand in his own, intertwining their fingers and gently rubbing his thumb along the back of it. But I want to. Mike felt lightheaded. Well, I didn't say it. You didn't have to. Mike glanced down at their connected hands as Will spoke again, but he didn't hear what he was saying. He blinked, pulling his attention back up to Will's face. How was he supposed to concentrate on what Will was saying when their palms were brushing together with intentionality? And of Will's own volition, no less. Wait, sorry, what? I said I'll have some too if it'll make you feel better. Well, now Mike had to say yes. He gave in, and Will nodded in approval before letting go of Mike's hand. Those few sweet seconds would have been enough to last Mike for another year and a half without him, but now Will was making him pancakes. There was no turning back after this. Will headed to the kitchen, turning back when he noticed Mike standing in the middle of the room and gesturing for Mike to follow him, chuckling to himself. Damn Will for being so aware of the effect he had on Mike. They made it into the kitchen, and Will headed to the pantry while Mike hopped up on the counter like when they were kids. Old habits die hard. Will eyed him from where he stood, grabbing the box of Bisquick. He ritualistically walked around the kitchen grabbing eggs, milk, vegetable oil, and a bowl, before setting them all down on the counter. He paused in what he was doing to reach over to his coffee pot, pouring a mug, grabbing the sugar bowl, and dumping whatever was left into the mug before handing it to Mike, who took it with gracious hands. He'd remembered the way Mike took his coffee. Black, no cream, and a diabetes-level fuck-ton of sugar. Thank you. That didn't even begin to cover how Mike felt about it. Will hummed in response as he got to work, cracking an egg into the bowl and whisking it around. So what have you been up to? I mean, besides hooking up with the entire male population of Indianapolis and failing out of school? Will asked, and Mike died a little on the inside. Truth hurts sometimes, Wheeler. Deal with it. Geez, Will. Harsh. Warn a guy next time. Mike frowned, sipping on his coffee. I've been working on a novel. Ooh, do tell. Will exclaimed, turning to Mike as he stirred the batter, the sweatshirt he wore. Mike's sweatshirt. Stretching as his muscles flexed underneath the fabric of the sleeves. Mike set his coffee down next to him and shifted so his hands were squished under his thighs. That way he wouldn't be able to do what he truly wanted to, which was to grab Will by his waist and shove his tongue down his throat as he ran his fingertips over Will's arms. It's a mythological coming of age with a bit of a twist. The protagonist is gay. Oh my god. Will grinned, all teeth. That is great. I love that. I love you, Mike thought, but held his tongue. Right? But yeah, I've been working on that and journaling a lot. Well, journaling was a synonym of writing dozens upon dozens of love letters, right? But Will didn't have to know that. Mike Wheeler using a therapist-approved coping mechanism? I'm proud of you, Will said. Mike preened at the praise as he pulled one of his hands out from under his leg to pick up his mug. There was a beat of silence, and Will stood there, his eyes fixed on Mike for a strangely long time as the pancake sizzled. Mike watched Will's Adam's apple bob up and down. He was either hallucinating, tripping, or Will was checking Mike out. But what about you? Mike asked, effectively snapping Will out of his trance. Any groundbreaking endeavors I should be caught up on? Will shrugged as he plated the perfectly congruent golden pancakes he'd made. I've been working on this new painting for a while now. It's a watercolor piece, so it's kind of out of my comfort zone, Will explained, turning to the refrigerator to grab a bottle of Canadian maple syrup. Mike nodded at what Will was telling him, but something else dwelled in the forefront of his mind. Yeah, you're more into oils on canvas, right? Mike asked, and Will's eyes snapped up to meet his, establishing an understanding between the two of them. I saw the painting, Mike remarked slowly, trying his best not to freak Will out or make him feel ashamed of it. I've gotta say, you flatter me, Byers. I am not that attractive. Will couldn't hide a smile. Shut up, yes you are. Will handed Mike a plate, and Mike thanked him as they dug in, the two young men standing at and sitting on the counter as they ate. Mike cut into his pancakes, stabbing a bite-sized piece with his fork and swirling it around in the syrup on his plate. He looked up when he heard a similar scratching noise and saw Will doing the same thing. Will met Mike's gaze, light smile gracing his face as he lifted the fork up and popped the piece into his mouth. Mike blushed when he realized he'd been staring and quickly focused back on his own plate. He chewed the piece of pancake he'd cut and confirmed to himself only after one bite that these were the best pancakes he'd ever had. These were pancakes of reconciliation. He turned towards Will to compliment his culinary skills, which would inevitably be shot down with the humble, "They're just pancakes, Mike," only to see Will staring at Mike already. Will's eyes jumped from Mike to the floor to the kitchen cabinet to the floor and back to Mike all within the span of 5 seconds. Mike held his attention this time when he licked his lips, and Will watched intently as the syrup disappeared. God, Mike felt like he was in high school all over again. Those 4 years had felt like a rom-com movie montage of staring, quick touches, and flirting back and forth. The only difference between those movies and real life was the reserved, cautious nature behind every single stare, touch, and flirtation. But this time around, Mike noticed, Will seemed more confident in himself, more purposeful in the way he carried and expressed himself. Everything lingered for longer than normal, than acceptable, than usual. It was a promising sign. Once they'd finished their pancakes and put their dishes in the sink, Mike and Will headed to Will's room. There was something intimate about entering Will's space like this. Something sacred, something previously unattainable. That was the dresser that held all of Will's clothes. That was the desk Will drew at. That was the bed Will slept in. That was the phone Will had used to break Mike's heart. Mike admired the dark blue walls, decorated modestly with a few more posters before he came across Will's framed Hawkins High School diploma. Mike remembered that day vividly. After everyone in the party had walked across the stage and gone back to Mike's house to celebrate, Will had brought their friends into a secluded area of the house and told them he was gay. Mike, who had been head over heels in love with his best friend for over 5 years at that point, was having a crisis because, oh my god, Will was gay, and the flirting might not have all been in his head. Maybe he had a chance, but every interaction between them following that day was strictly platonic, and Will made sure Mike knew it, so Mike withdrew after a while, not wanting to keep stringing himself along like he had been. Little did I know that everything would change. Mike said more to himself than to Will, but Will walked over to stand next to him, close enough that their arms brushed. "Why, because I came out?" he asked, looking up at Mike, who didn't reciprocate the action, but instead kept staring straight ahead at the diploma as if it were a portal that would take him back in time to before his world imploded. "No, not because you came out. Because then, I fell under the delusion that I could finally have you." He looked down at Will then. "But then I fucked it all up in August." Will turned his body so he could fully face Mike before saying, "Okay, I'm confused. I've gotta ask. What's your recollection of that night?" Mike didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to remember it. Hell, he didn't even want to think about it. But Mike took a second to reason with himself because Will was standing beside him. Will was asking something of him, and the least he could do after everything was oblige to Will's one request. So Mike told him. It was the summer of 1989, and all was well. Hawkins was no longer nationally renowned as an extraterrestrial hybrid between Earth and Hell, but simply as a small town in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. It was the summer of 1989, and Mike was lying on the basement couch with his legs hanging off the edge. His eyes were closed, and he wore his headphones, which were attached to his Walkman, playing Will's mixtape on repeat, just as Mike had from the second it fell into his hands back in 1986. He felt the thumps of the opening and closing of the basement door, followed by light footsteps treading down the stairs. He cracked a singular eye open, but opened them both fully when he registered that it was Will who was entering his space. He always loved when Will came to his house unannounced. There was a certain element of familiarity, of family, of domesticity. "Mike, we've got to talk," Will said, his voice a bit edgier than usual. "Okay, what's up? Are you—" Mike sat up, pulling his headphones fully off his head and resting them around his neck. Then he saw the look on Will's face. He looked livid. "What the fuck are these?" Will spat. Mike's eyes widened at what Will held in his hands. Fuck. How on earth did he find them? Mike thought he had hidden them well enough. Apparently he was sorely mistaken because Will held Mike's letters, all 26 of them, all addressed to Will, in his shaking hands. Mike couldn't even begin to explain, mouth hanging wide open. "Dear Will," the boy with the bowl cut began with a snarl, "when I look into your eyes, I see the rest of my life. Dear Will, why does loving you feel so wrong yet so right? Dear Will, I want you to hold me in your arms forever, because it's the only place I can truly call home." Mike wanted to die. "I don't know what to. Why the hell are these addressed to me? And why are there so many?" "Because," Mike squeaked out, eyes wide with intimidation, "they were for you. You were never meant to find those, I swear to God." "Are you making fun of me or something?" Will snapped, and Mike flinched. He'd never seen Will this angry before. He stood up then, his face on fire with inferiority from where he'd been on the couch as Will towered over him. Now, Mike was the one looking down at Will, whose chest was heaving with unadulterated rage. "Come on, Will. I'm your best friend, and you really thought I'd make fun of you for being gay?" Mike kept his tone soft, what the party called his Will voice, TM, trying to calm Will down. It worked, at least a little bit, because Will's breathing became more regulated, and less metaphorical smoke escaped his ears. But his eyes were still a menacing shade of green, his pupils blown wide. "Well, no." Will's voice was lower this time, laced with venom. "But that does not mean you get to fuck around at my expense." Will could not have been more wrong. Mike was anything but fucking around. Malice was the last thing on his mind when he thought about Will. When he thought about Will, he felt safe, he felt hopeful, he felt valuable, and he felt worthy. What he felt for Will was pure love, and he'd say it out loud if he didn't hate himself so much. I poured my heart out in those letters, Mike told him, taking a step forward. Will stepped back. I didn't write them for shits and fucking giggles, they were genuine, he continued, following Will as he backed away, stopping only when he had Will caged in between his arms back against the wall of the basement. Will held onto Mike's wrists, their watches positioned side by side. Mike closed his eyes and took a shaky breath, collecting himself in preparation for what he was about to say next. Confession time. I wanted to send them so badly. I just didn't because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Mike opened his eyes, drinking in the expression on Will's flustered face. He blinked slowly, lashes fluttering, and fuck, he could hear Will's heartbeat. He licked his lips. Afraid of what? I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid of our country. I'm afraid of this town. I'm afraid of my family. I'm afraid of your dad. I'm afraid of myself. But I'm not afraid of you, Will. I'm not afraid of you. And with that, Mike leaned down and kissed Will. Those were the best 5 seconds of Mike's life by far. Will's lips were smooth yet firm. They were warm. Mike wanted to kiss Will forever. He allowed himself for once in his life to take what he wanted and moved his hands down from the wall to Will's hips, gripping them with all of his pent-up passion, holding him close. He felt Will's hands meet Mike's shoulders and he was pushing Mike away. Oh no. What are you doing, Mike? Is this a joke? What was it with Will thinking everything was so fucking funny to Mike? He just bared his soul to the love of his life, but Will had interpreted everything as simply cruel humor. That was what Will thought of Mike. He wouldn't stand for it. No, Will, I'm in love with you, he said in full earnest, grabbing Will's hand just like he'd always done throughout the years whenever Will felt angry, alone, or scared. In turn, Will aggressively shook Mike's hand away like it burned him. Don't say that. Please don't say that. You don't mean it. What the hell? What makes you think I don't? You're... Will forced his words out in a state of panic, ducking out of Mike's reach as he headed for the stairs. I can't do this. Not now. Please don't go. Hear me out. Mike pleaded, getting desperate now. Will, you've got to believe me. Will turned around from where he stood, halfway to the basement door, his gaze ice cold. Well, I don't, Mike. I don't believe you. Mike took back what he thought about not being afraid of Will. He was terrified. He watched Will stomp up the rest of the way, slamming the door behind him. Mike put a hand up to his mouth, muffling a sob. What had he done? Mike stopped his pacing for a moment to breathe. He'd gotten it all out, and by some miracle, without breaking down. He looked over at Will, who rested his chin on his palm as he sat on his bed, staring into space. I never got the chance to explain myself. You just shut off. Will blinked a few times, looking up at Mike with that same blank expression, and Mike wanted to scream, but he didn't. He didn't have the energy. Will breathed out hard through his nose, getting up from his spot on the bed and meeting Mike where he was at, placing a hand on his arm. Mike didn't move. All this talk about Will abandoning him caused some of the resentment to return, but Will took Mike's chin and moved it so their eyes could meet again. He looked sad. Because I had convinced myself that you could never love me the way I loved you. But all of a sudden, you were telling me that you loved me romantically and wanted to be with me forever. How can you blame me for being thrown off? Mike shrugged, resigned. I can't. And he meant it. He couldn't blame Will for being thrown off because Mike had gone through the complete opposite, having felt led on and let down. But you also can't blame me for waiting so long to say something. I literally hated myself for years for being gay. Will's hand that held his chin lowered down to the space between his neck and his shoulder, and he went to reply, but Mike spoke faster. And when you came out, I thought maybe I could too. But then another part of me didn't want to say anything, because coming clean about my true feelings for you would have destroyed everything we worked so hard to build back up after California. Well, I didn't make it any easier by keeping you at arm's length after I came out, Will said as he ran his thumb back and forth along Mike's sweatshirt sleeve. I tried to convince myself I was okay with being just friends in order to protect myself, you know? Yeah. Mike's tone was rough as he crossed his arms, and Will pulled away. Nice going, Mike, you fucking asshole. I mean, Mike softened his voice. I get your thought process. I just felt so rejected. And after August, it felt so final. Like I really thought you had zero feelings for me, and that I had severely misread things. You didn't. Believe me, Mike, you didn't. The words tumbled out of Will's mouth, startling both of them at once. Mike looked down, feeling the beginnings of tears pricking his eyes. "I'm trying to." Will reached out to Mike and pulled his hand up into his own, his fingertips gently mapping out the veins that spread out beneath Mike's skin. "Do you still hate yourself now?" he asked, and Mike looked up slowly. "I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, I do," he admitted, playing with Will's fingers as he spoke. He was not proud of the person he'd become. He relived every single one of his mistakes on a constant loop, with each day bleeding into the next. The shame devoured him like a hungry beast. Every waking moment without Will felt like suffocation. Mike slowed his movements before confessing something else, something he never thought he'd ever be able to. "But I hate living my life without you even more." Will let out a small sniffle at that, and Mike was quick to comfort him, his hands flying up to cup his face and swipe the tears away. Will leaned into the touch, his voice breaking. "I hate living my life without you too." "Can I?" Mike hesitated, uncertainty flooding his thoughts, but he swiftly pushed it away. "Can I hug you?" he asked. Will nodded, laughing wetly as he said, "Yes, of course." Mike pulled Will into a tight embrace, warmth filling his body instantly as Will's head fell against his chest, right over his heart. He could only imagine what Will was thinking, granted the fact that his heart was thrumming at record speed. Will ran his hands up Mike's back, pulling him down slightly by his shoulder blades. Mike nestled his nose in Will's shaggy hair, breathing him in. He still washed his hair with the coconut shampoo he'd always used. In order to avoid the temptation to inhale Will's scalp like a vacuum, he opted to place a feather-light kiss there, so light that in the future, only he would remember it happening. As they stood there, their bodies flush against one another, Mike knew he didn't need a wash to tell that time as an entity ceased to exist. Mike and Will held each other tightly as the rest of the world fell away. This was what Mike had been waiting for. Just this. He finally felt whole again. He wasn't sure how long they'd been clinging to each other or who pulled away first, but he was sure of the fact that both of them were crying. Again. "God damn it," Mike laughed, practically slapping a sweatshirt sleeve up to his face to absorb the tears that fell there. "Since when have you been a frequent crier?" Will teased, and Mike remembered that Will had never been exposed to the outcome of his emotional revolution before. "What can I say?" Mike continued the bit. "Your loyalty program has really good perks." "Can't argue there," Will laughed, leaning his forehead onto Mike's chest again as Mike's hands ran up and down Will's sides. He memorized the feel of Will's improved physique, trailing his hands upwards until his hands met Will's chest. "Also," Mike said into the silence, causing Will to twitch slightly, but not enough to remove his forehead from Mike's chest. "The heart? Didn't know I was still held in such high esteem." Will's hands, which had been resting on Mike's hips, moved forward until they were wrapped around Mike's lower back. "You've always been my heart, Mike," Will told him, voice steady and sure. "You never really stopped." Mike felt his jaw drop, barely able to process what he was hearing. The words that left Will's lips ricocheted around Mike's brain, and he might have forgotten how to breathe for a minute. He needed Will to pinch him, so he could wake up from this. If it wasn't real, it would be a nightmare. Instead of asking Will to do it for him, he pinched himself, and felt butterflies erupt in his stomach when he didn't snap his eyes open to the sight of his bedroom back in Indianapolis. He was still here, in Will's room, and Will was holding him rather sensually, and Mike felt so fucking alive. "So, where do we go from here?" Mike whispered. And Will lifted his head, an unrecognizable look in his eyes. Mike backed away, fear slowly entering the peripherals of his mind, all possible worst-case scenarios threatening to cave in on him. He'd gone too far, been too forward, taken Will for granted, given off the impression of an ulterior motive. "Sorry," he said, almost a reflex at this point in his life. He always had something to be sorry for, something to make up for, something to... "Me too," Will whispered, grabbing Mike's wrist before he could get too far. He pulled Mike back in sharply and grabbed him by the back of his neck, tugging him all the way down until their lips collided. Mike let out a little noise in absolute shock, but not wasting any time as he shoved his hands into Will's hair, raising his head as he leaned into the heat of Will's mouth. While Mike's hands remained pretty central to Will's upper body, Will's hands roved Mike everywhere they possibly could. They lifted from Mike's lower back, up his torso, past his chest, around the back of Mike's head to brush the nape of his neck, through Mike's long hair, then back down to grope Mike's ass. Mike squeaked into Will's mouth, and he responded with a low hum of a laugh that sent vibrations through Mike's body and set him ablaze. Mike lowered his grip on Will's shoulders to his biceps, squeezing them the way he'd wanted to since Will opened the door earlier that morning. Will broke the kiss then, smirking up at the taller man. You really like my arms, don't you? Yeah, how'd you notice? Mike tried to be sarcastic, but ended up sounding breathless. Will pressed a chaste kiss to Mike's lips, turning them around and backing Mike up until his calves hit the base of Will's bed. Mike was sure he had died and gone to heaven. He wouldn't stop ogling. You were being so fucking obvious. It was hilarious, Will teased. And Mike whined a little in embarrassment, but Will was having none of it, so he pushed Mike backwards until his back hit the mattress. Don't worry, babe, it was cute. Babe. Mike had thought Will would only call him that in his dreams. But this wasn't a dream. Mike watched as Will climbed on top of him, one leg on either side of his waist, and leaned down to kiss him, nice and slow. Mike ran his tongue along Will's lower lip, and he let Mike in immediately. They continued like that for a few minutes until Will lifted Mike's arms so they were pinned above his head, and Mike quietly moaned as Will began to kiss down his neck. He smiled at the ceiling. Mike Wheeler loved Will Byers, and Will Byers loved Mike Wheeler. All was right with the world. But Mike would have a lot to explain over Christmas. You've been listening to the audiobook version of This Is Me Trying by Love Kurt on Tumblr, AO3, Wattpad, etc. Thank y'all so much for reading, for listening to the audiobook, for sending your kudos, comments, and asks. I am blown away by the love this story has gotten, literally everywhere. But yeah, follow my Tumblr at Love Kurt to keep up with all my latest publications. There's a companion fic coming out called Now That We Don't Talk, and a sequel called Don't Blame Me. But yeah, thank you. Stay safe, stay tuned. Cool, bye.